And then let's go over now to Abuja as we switch to another matter. Nata.
Thank you, Chamberlain, and welcome to Abuja. We have with us the Minister of Finance, Mrs. Kemi Adeosun. Thank you for joining us.
Morning.
I hope you're doing good.
Well, good.
All right, I think the economy is doing good. I mean, we just read in the papers that the Naira appreciated and the NIFEX platform to about 6% or thereabout. But let's leave that aside and look at this matter of borrowing.
Okay.
I mean, anytime Nigerians hear the government is going to borrow, there's always that, what a game. Why?
Well, thank you and good morning. I think we have to understand the context. And to do that, we've got to go back. I know I always go back, but you have to go back sometimes to go forward. When we got into office, as you know, the oil price had collapsed, and our main source of revenue was oil. So we had two choices. You have to balance your books if you don't have revenue. You either cut what you spend, or you try and increase what you have available. If we cut what we spent, it would have meant cutting back on public services, largely laying off public sector workers. And for the APC government, that was not an option. The other option was to carry on with what the previous administration had been doing. The previous administration had effectively been borrowing, but just to pay salaries. Now, what we recognise is if you just keep the status quo, you can't grow. So what we then said is, no, we need to do a fiscal expansion. That is a bigger budget to create some headroom for capital projects, because those capital projects will actually drive growth. Paying salaries doesn't drive growth. It's like borrowing money to eat breakfast. After a while, you know, you have to invest in what is productive. So that was the thinking when we came into office back in 2015, and that's why we expanded the size of our budget. Now, in the short term, we knew that revenues would not be there. Oil price was low, tax collections were low, so we would have to borrow. In the first 2 years, you would see an acceleration in borrowing. And then, as the economy begins to recover and revenues begin to come in, the pace at which we're borrowing will come down. Now, having said that, Nigeria's borrowing is actually very low relative to the size of our GDP. It's one of the areas where we're doing very well. We have a GDP debt to GDP of 17%. Ghana is at 68. South Africa is at about 52. Most developed countries are above 50. The guideline, the threshold for a developing economy is 40. We're at 17. And just by contrast, Britain's at 89, America's at over 100. Even Germany, which is probably the most conservative borrowing country in Europe, is at 68. So we're not in huge amounts of debt. What we're trying to make sure we do is that we grow the debt and link it to capital projects. That's what's critical. Don't borrow for recurrent. Borrow and channel it into assets that will get the economy going: power, roads, rail, and all the various projects we're doing. So that's why, that's the strategy and that's the thinking around borrowing. Now, to the specific one, the one that's causing all the furore, first thing is that there seems to be some misconception. So out of that $5.5 billion, $2.5 billion is for the 2017 budget. $3 billion is simply to refinance money that we already owe. We inherited a lot of treasury bills. So every 90 days or every 180 days, those bills mature and we have to pay interest on them. It doesn't make sense because we can't pay them off. So what we want to do is take $3 billion, and then as the treasury bills mature, we will refinance from Naira into dollars. That does two things. It lowers our cost of borrowing because obviously the interest rate in the international market is much lower than the interest rates here in Nigeria. Secondly, and more importantly, there's this issue that government is borrowing so much that it's crowding out the private sector. We're making interest rates so high. When banks can earn 19% lending to government, it means that when you and I want to borrow, it's 26. So if government begins to progressively reduce the amount it's borrowing in Naira, we believe that will create the convergence to bring down interest rates. So that's part of the strategy. So out of the 5.5 is not 5.5 new loan. $3 billion we already owe. We're simply converting from Naira into dollars, and 2.5 is new borrowings.
You know, as commendable as that may be, the concern nowadays about, okay, yes, you're borrowing to invest in infrastructure. How much of that is happening?
A lot. A huge amount. I mean, you saw, I think a couple of weeks ago, we finished the Sukuk. Immediately, we called the contractors, and you could see, you ask each contractor, add up how much they got, it got to the exact 100 billion. We are being very disciplined about making sure that, yes, we're borrowing, but we're making sure we do the capital projects. And I know that, you know, the ministers that are being charged with these particular areas are working very, very hard. Thing is, major capital projects take time. you know, roads, but they're once and for all projects. If we get our railway going and we maintain it well, it'll be here for the next 40 years. You do a road, it's there for the you know, if you maintain it well, it's there for the next 30, 40 years. So these are transformational projects, and they're ongoing. Last year we did 1.3 trillion. We're hoping to do the same this year.
Now, if that being the case, Nigeria at a point was debt-free. And
never been debt-free.
Well,
never
had our
been
debts cancelled. I mean,
okay.
Foreign debts cancelled and all that. And a lot of people were like really rejoicing and all. But is this not another way of taking Nigeria into another debt situation internationally?
Okay. So let me explain what the Paris Club and London Club debts were and why there was this cancellation. Paris Club and London Club debts were loans, and they were variable interest rate loans. So what was happening was, if there was a change in LIBOR, which is the British interest rate, the rates would change. And so Nigerian state and federal governments who had borrowed found that they were in a debt trap, because every month or any time there was a change in interest rate, the amount they owed went up, and it was uncontrollable. And it was not just Nigeria, it was a lot of African countries, and I think you remember that time there was this debt forgiveness movement. Yes, and actually at the time, if you recall, they didn't want to give Nigeria debt forgiveness because they believed that Nigeria was a rich country. The then Minister of Finance, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, was able to persuade them and do a negotiation that basically we weren't given debt forgiveness. What they did was they recalibrated the debts. We actually paid off the debts and got some discount on those debts. Now, after that came in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, the setting up of the DMO. And what Nigeria did very sensibly was say, OK, now we don't want a situation where states and local governments can just go and borrow internationally and no one knows about it. Let's have a central coordination. So you have the Debt Management Office who do debt sustainability on every loan and who coordinate the data, because what was happening was people didn't know how much Nigerian state, local governments and so on owed. So that came in. And secondly, the second reform was that Nigeria would not do loans. We don't take loans. Now, why is that important? We do bonds. Bond is at a fixed interest rate. You can predict what you owe. It's not something that's variable. So those are two huge reforms that have happened since the Paris Club and London Club debt forgiveness. And, you know, the borrowing we're doing now are bonds. And they're tied to capital projects. They're specific, and we're very clear about what we're doing. So there's no prospect of taking us back into those dark days where, you know, a government would wake up and find that what it owes has doubled overnight. That's not possible anymore.
Interesting. Now, the other side of it is... OK, let's bring it down as simple as possible. So we have this thing we're going to borrow. But we keep talking about revenues not being at par. Yeah. How is it that we're going to be able to keep our borrowing and our revenues, our interest rates rather, when we borrow? Can we keep it at, how would I put it now, reasonable rates?
Well, that's what I was telling you about, the strategy behind refinancing some of the Naira into dollars. One of the strategies we have as a government from a macro perspective is how do we bring down interest rates? And we've sat down with the central bank governor and realised that, look, the biggest problem with interest rates is government borrowing, because at the moment we have to borrow. If we continue to borrow in Naira, we keep the rate high. So let's refinance some of these borrowings. Let's stop issuing 90-day, 180-day Treasury bills. Let's come out of that market. That will begin to reduce pressure on Nigerian interest rates and allow the CBN, hopefully the MPC, to take the decision we all need, which is to bring down the rate of interest.
Will that cost money to be more available to the average man who needs to borrow money for his smaller, medium-scale enterprise?
Absolutely.
At what rate would that be?
You know, there was a time when interest rates in Nigeria were pretty low. And we're moving in that right direction because, you know, reserves are going up. Those are the factors you need. If you want to reduce your interest rates, you've got a lot of portfolio flows, foreign flows coming in. They look at your reserve figure. Fortunately, our reserves are heading upwards. So the convergence criteria for the MPC being able to reduce interest rates seem to be moving in the right direction. And I'm optimistic that early next year we'll start to see some reduction in the MPR.
I was going to ask you a question about timelines, but my colleague in Lagos has a question for you. Gimba.
Well, I'm looking at the lines of perception, really, because this borrowing of $5.5 billion at a time to, of course, finance the budget and to try to push some of that into capital projects and then also servicing some of our debts. for many, it's a laudable approach towards offsetting some of our debts. But the concern here, and I said this is with regards to perception, the concern here is that this borrowing is coming in too late and perhaps will not even achieve what you set to get at the end of the day.
Okay, well, good morning. Don't agree with that point. Remember that the budget was only passed in June. So we're actually in the 4th month of the budget cycle, and the budget is due to run for up to 12 months. So these are 2017 budget projects that were approved by the National Assembly. We've already released about 440, I think it's 460 billion of capital since June. And so we're borrowing now, the money that we're raising now will hopefully be released in November and December, take us through into January, and make sure that those projects that are in the budget that we intend to execute are adequately financed. So the timing is fine. Remember that we were already in the Eurobond market this year in February, so you can't keep coming to the market. You've got to time it. So we needed this gap, and the market internationally has been very receptive to the Nigerian debt story because they know that we're managing our debts very prudently. And I'm sure you remember that in February when we came out looking for $1 billion, we were offered 8. So I think internationally, the debt management story is seen as a very prudent and a very acceptable one. So I think we'll be able to attain our objectives.